Hi there. This is Alan Story speaking. I'm speaking to you on behalf of The Left Lane Presents. The Left Lane Presents is the new YouTube channel of the Substack, The Left Lane. So, Novara Media, watch out. We're coming down the lane right behind you. Well, that's meant as a joke, of course. Um, so, when the left lane kicks off our channel, why not talk about one of the most important questions for a socialist left wing group, a subsect, but trade unions? And I'm really pleased that today we have Gregor Gall as our guest to speak. Now, he is a really leading expert on trade unions in the UK. He is also a good socialist colleague. So, why not have him be the person who speaks on trade unions, and we're gonna talk about his book on Mick Lynch. And I was an academic myself, like Gregor was, and still is. I'm retired. Gregor is not a suck. Like he calls it as he sees it, and it's a very illuminating book. Uh, as I say, he's a political analyst, an author. He's written books on Bob Crow, Tommy Sheridan. I first met Mick when he wrote a really good piece for the Left Lane on the Scottish Socialist Party, which he was a member of 20 years ago. Really interesting. And so I'm really pleased that Gregor Gall, today up in Glasgow, is speaking to the Left Lane Presents in our first video. So this is the book. It's called Mick Lynch, The Making of a Working Class Hero. And it came out earlier in 2024. And so let's make our first question here. Gregor, you're obviously a big believer in the importance of trade unions. Why do you think people should join trade unions? I mean, we have a labor government now. Maybe that's going to solve it all. Why do you think it's worthwhile you as a researcher to look at trade unions?
First of all, Alan, thanks very much for having me on your Left Lane YouTube channel. I hope it goes well, and I hope that this first broadcast, if you like, kicks it off down that road. In terms of the two questions you've just posed, as a socialist of a Marxist persuasion, to me, workers need to be organised at the points of production, distribution, and exchange. In other words, in their workplaces, because I believe that is where they will be able to generate the greatest amounts of power of leverage in order to prosecute their interests, especially their economic or material interests. So I think workers need to do that. Unions are probably the most direct form of collective organisation that workers can form and engage in, even though, of course, they have paid officials and general secretaries who are elected to do things on their behalf. Nonetheless, at the workplace level, they can organise themselves, and by taking part in the democratic processes of their own unions, they can influence the union's policies as well as seek to hold their general secretaries to account. So I think that there's a fundamental reason there. That's, if you like, going back to Marx when he talked about what a socialist society would look like. He emphasized that it would be through the self emancipation of the working class. And it's inconceivable that there can be any self emancipation of the working class without workers organizing in the workplace. Because at the end of the day, despite the kind of superstructure of politics and parliament and everything else, at the end of the day, capitalism is essentially an economic system, and the workplaces, whether they are real or virtual, whether they're in retail or manufacturing, those are the absolute foundations of capitalism. So, to me, as a socialist, as I say, of Marxist persuasion, not only do I think workers should be join unions, be active in their unions, and so on, but as an academic, as a researcher, you can obviously see why I would think it would then be important as a follow on, as a consequence, to study unions to understand the nature of them, their dynamics, why sometimes unions win, why sometimes they lose, why some union leaders are better than others, why it's important that workers are organised within their unions through fractions or factions, things like that. And it all comes down to where we are in 2024. Despite what's happened in the last couple of years, the union movement in Britain and in many other parts of the world is now weaker than it has been in a generation. It would be easy to think that the uptick in strikes of the last couple of years, which is now the highest it has been over the last 40 years, it would be easy to think that unions are now in a position of being much stronger, much more assertive. But in actual fact, in 2022, 200,000 people left unions. So that is to say that unions, despite the strike uptick, by the end of 2022 had 200,000 less members than they did at the end of 2021. So the notion that strikes in and of themselves build union membership is clearly taking a knock on the head there.
Okay,
Uh,
let me
the,
jump in now. Let's now talk about Mick Lynch. He sort of came to prominence and General Secretary of the RMT Union. How and why did Mick Lynch become, as your book says, a working class hero in the summer of 2022?
it's a term that other people use. I don't use it in terms of my own analysis of him. I obviously have criticisms of him, but I also celebrate a number of things that he's done and that he embodies. But it was other people that started calling Mick Lynch a working class hero. And they did so for a number of obvious reasons. One was that the RMT union was essentially first out of the traps in the summer of 2022 to have national strike action. So therefore, Mick Lynch was on on the television, on the radio. The RMT is a union in the railway sector, the railway industry, has potentially more power than many other unions, particularly amongst the signalling workforce, where if the signallers go on strike, then trains are not safe to run. But it was also because, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was no longer leader of the Labour Party. Having been defenestrated by the right, there was a vacuum for a left wing radical voice, which Mick Lynch was more than capable of filling. So you have this kind of coming together of different factors. And essentially, Mick Lynch is in the right place at the right time, saying the right things, providing a radical, critical voice that hadn't been heard in the media for many years, speaking in a forthright and frank manner, but also in very kind of um, not simplistic, but simple terms. And I mean that in a good way, simple terms that people could readily understand. And so there was a resonance to what he said, and people connected with him. Hence the people remembering the likes of John Lennon's song "A Working Class Hero is Something to Be," started calling him that. And if you think about the kind of paraphernalia that developed after that, you could buy T-shirts, mugs, tote bags, a whole number of things, a whole number of bits of paraphernalia, which had on them Mick Lynch as a working class hero. So he, as I say, he was in the right place at the right time, saying the right things. In my book, I question whether he has done the right things, which is a separate kind of uh, factor of assessing him as a working class hero. But to be fair to Mick Lynch, many working class heroes are only those that say certain things, whether it be George Best or Ray Houghton. Um, but when they are union leaders, like Arthur Scargill, like Bob Crow, I think we must be slightly more discerning and demanding of them in terms of, well, what did they say, but also what did they do, and does the act follow up and reinforce what they were saying?
Okay, so now the media, I'm quoting here from your book, much of the right wing media sought to portray Lynch as a dangerous, militant, Marxist revolutionary. Is there something wrong with that assessment?
It couldn't be further from the truth. That's, of course, not to say that Mick Lynch is a right wing reactionary. He is not. But what he is a social democrat. And if people recall the figure of Roy Hattersley, who for many years was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Roy Hattersley and Neil Kinnock were elected in, I think it was been just 1983, as part of the Dream Ticket to lead the Labour Party. Neil Kinnock was the left wing candidate. Roy Hattersley was the right wing candidate. the left and the right were supposed to be able to work together, hence it being called the Dream Ticket. So Roy Hattersley was always on the right. But as the Labour Party moved to the right and even further to the right and past Roy Hattersley, he started to seem to be radical. And he was a right wing social democrat. Now, I think Mick Lynch is a left wing social democrat, but a social democrat nonetheless. And therefore, it seems because we are now in our 40th odd year of living through neoliberalism, that Mick Lynch is much more radical than he actually is. But nonetheless, that left wing social democracy that Mick Lynch embodies is what gives him, along with his own kind of persona and his way of presenting arguments, that set of politics, that worldview, is what gives Mick Lynch his cutting edge, and is also the reason essentially why people call him a working class hero, because he does talk about workers, he does talk about capitalism, he's critical of capitalism and its neoliberal variant. And I can come on later on to what his position is on the Labour Party and Keir Starmer, and it's not all that you might think it is.
Right. Let's just what about what he did in the RMT union, the union he was leading, the way they conducted strikes? I've read your book. Yes, they got media attention, and he was a very skilled media performer. But like, what about this question about a strike fund? What about the tactics they use? I know our viewers are not all going to be interested in every minutiae of the RMT union, but what is your overall view of the way he operated on the critical side, as running these strikes, building union democracy, this kind of thing?
My major criticism of Mick Lynch as a union leader, as General Secretary of the RMT, is that he has shown a lack of strategic planning. What I mean by this is it was self-evident that the RMT would be engaged sooner or later in a major confrontation with the government. The previous Labour government, that's going back to Blair and Brown, they had wanted to reform the railway industry, cut the level of public subsidy to it. They commissioned the McNulty report. The Tories then did their own version of it. So this was a train coming down the track, if I can use that term. And then on top of that, there was the cost of living crisis. So, what a sensible union leader with foresight, with strategic planning ability would have done is to set up a strike fund in advance of the dispute starting in the summer of 2022. And that would be to provide strike pay to those that were being called out on strike. The irony is that with inflation north of 10%, asking people to go on strike without strike pay for higher wages when there was no absolute certainty that they would win, let alone win quickly, was asking them to make huge sacrifices in terms of their income. But that could have been offset by doing this. Now, it's interesting to know that the RMT has over £25 million in stocks and shares that it's built up over the years. Those could have been liquidated to provide the funding for a strike fund. All that the RMT has is a dispute fund, which it has asked members of the public essentially to contribute to donate to, and the National Union has put some of its own money in there. But it was never going to be enough to sustain 40,000 workers on strike for any length of time at all. So I think Mick Lynch should have planned ahead. He should have taken a lesson out of Unite's book when Len McCluskey set up a strike fund in 2012. But he should also remembered what went on in the late 1980s when he was part of a union that was involved in this. This was the Drive for 35, which is when two right-wing union leaders, Bill Jordan and Gavin Laird of the Engineering Union, developed a multi-million pound strike fund in order to bring their members out and strike in pursuit of a shorter working week, which was probably one of the most successful strikes of the 1980s. And there weren't that many successful strikes in the 1980s. So that's my major criticism of Mick Lynch as a union leader. There are others, but I mean, for the time being, I think I'll just stick with that.
Yeah, so he led them into battle, but they weren't really fully prepared to take on, the British state, the Tory government, etc. What we're now, moved to a different government now. How do you, assess uh, the state of the trade union movement now? Now with a labor government, labor is that on the workers' side? How is this? How is the trade union movement in your view? We're just getting started here. What are their strengths and weaknesses when, in fact, there's going to be some obviously conflicts ahead?
The situation for the union movement, as whenever there is a Labour government in office, is a difficult one. It's full of contradictions, it's full of complexities, but not to get too kind of concerned about, you know, without not to get too concerned so that we can't have a general overview of the situation. It is one where this is not a social democratic Labour government by any means. It is a Labour government that is enamoured to neoliberalism. So it's a variant of neoliberalism. It's obviously not the same as the Tories, but it is a variant of neoliberalism in the same way that Tony Blair and New Labour were variants of neoliberalism. Tony Blair called that the third way. But I expect there will be a number of ramifications from a Labour government. One, there will be some sections of the union movement will be willing and able to go into conflict, into battle against the Labour government. There will be others who will be unable and unwilling to do so. They might be unable to do so because they don't have the sufficient union density or the funds or the organisation to do so. Some of them will be unwilling to do so because they believe that this would be to give a gift to the Tories. We want Labour to be in office for more than one term, more than one 5-year term of government. They also believe that maybe the kind of expectations and demands that I would like to see a Labour government deliver upon are just, fanciful and unrealistic. So really, they might be saying Labour's not
Let me
great.
ask you a question on that. What do you think kinds of demands should unions be making today?
Many of the demands that are made are correct. I mean, for example, let's take Sharon Graham over the Employment Rights Bill that was laid before Parliament on the 10th of October this year. It had been diluted time and time again since it was originally created, and that was in a document called the New Deal for Working People. And Sharon Graham repeatedly used this phrase, which was that the bill is has more holes in it than Swiss cheese, and I think that's a reasonable assessment of the situation. So she's saying obviously it needs to be this, it needs to be that, it needs to be a lot more. That's the easy part to make the demands. The much harder part is what do you do about creating the leverage that you can then enforce the demands upon the Labour government? Because this has really got to be more than a war of words. Um, the force of an argument, that is to say, the words are never enough. You've got to have the argument of force as well. And so what that means is what pressure you're prepared to put on them. And I think if you look at the case of the RMT, when it has been critical, and this is through Mick Lynch's mouth, if you like, when it has been critical, it's talked about using its parliamentary group to do this and to do that. But I think we're at a stage where that's just not sufficient anymore, even if it ever was. And therefore, we've got to be looking about mass mobilisations outside Parliament, most obviously demonstrations, most obviously lobbies. But really, we've got to be looking at the like of strikes that become political strikes against the government. And the only union leader that is capable, in my view, of strategizing and theorizing about that at the moment is Matt Rack, who's the leader of the Fire Brigades Union. When he's just finished his 1-year term of office as the president of the Trade Union Congress, the TUC. He has been by far and away even better than Sharon Graham, who I have a lot of time for. He has been far better than any other union leader in terms of actually saying what needs to be done and how it should be done. Because many union leaders say, well, we need to hold the Labour government's feet to the fire, all well and good. But as I say, the question is how are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure that you are successful in prosecuting those demands?
Okay, Gregor, let's call it there. I know you're working on a book on the sex trade, something that I used to do researching on. When's that coming out? Is it next year?
Probably summer of 2026. I've got
Okay,
some.
let's make a date to have an interview on that subject. And thank you very much for this first, the Left Lane Presents video, and all the best to you up there in Glasgow.
Thank you for your time, Alan. Thanks. Bye.